Say it again.
Common sense is also common.
That's it. That's according to him. Isn't it? He probably would have agreed with it. All right. So, trench warfare, and very quickly both sides adopted very elaborate trenches. On the left, it's just kind of a generic schematic, and it showed the trench line was always curved or jagged. You put more men in the jagged line, and also when artillery round hits, the horrific round for the if it happens to hit in the trench, it only affects one area, not all the way down the wall. And they would make first, second, third lines, no man's land. Some areas might be a mile apart, some 50 yards apart. This is the real deal. Taken from an observation balloon from about 17,000 feet, which was hell on earth. Just imagine being on one of those balloons back in 1917. There's no heat. I mean, you're freezing up there, and especially the German balloons were hydrogen filled. I think you might know a problem with hydrogen, yeah. And so, but which one are the German lines and which one are the English lines here? The German are much more established. Remember, they're dug in. Well, the Allied lines were always pretty haphazard because they wanted their men to attack. And really quickly, both sides learned not only to dig deep, but if they thought an offensive was going to happen, they put almost no men in that first line, just a few little listening posts. They put everyone back here, and they'd run up to these communication trenches when they attacked again. Remember the Somme? And they used all those shells. They were inaccurate, a lot of them didn't work, and there's no one in the trenches. We're back here in bomb proofs, waiting. And trench life was horrific, and it was a battle of attrition. Kill so many of the enemy that they can no longer fight. So here's a couple scenes of trench warfare. This is in Gallipoli, and that's an Australian soldier putting up his tent helmet. Remember I showed you that from Petersburg in the Civil War where they held up their hat to count how many rounds were in it? That's what he's doing there. They're just gambling on how many bullets would be in there from snipers. And think about it, with modern rifles, a sniper with a scope could pick out someone from 500 yards away. So you stick your head up again. Here is a British soldier about ready to go over the top. This is a trench taken by Americans in the Argonne in 1918. And some bodies are still there, those they couldn't pull out. Here are German soldiers about ready to go over the top. Recognize the helmet? So, 1916, the Germans finally, they used cast of holes, they finally adopted steel helmets. And they would have another hat underneath this. They would not wear this on their head. And it fell starting to come off, which is sad, but to be expected. Put this way. Figure out a way. But I'll pass this around and let you look at this. It's not comfortable. Every helmet today copies the German helmet. So you see US soldiers, they wear a copy of this. Better design, better, lighter metal, but still really uncomfortable. The British and the Americans adopted the same helmet, lighter, and the thought was here, shrapnel would hit this. But it's not as good. You want to cover the ears. And the US had this until 1942. Then they adopted just basically a pot. They adopted a helmet like that one in 1980. Here's the British American. I don't have a French one. I would like a French one. French one were kind of heavy. Isn't that heavy? Imagine wearing that for 12 hours. That one's a lot lighter, but it's a better helmet. I guess I would wear it. And then trench life, therefore, would be miserable. Here they are picking lice out. Here, think about the mud and murk. If your feet are in this for hours, what is that? That's trench foot. So take a bath, jump in a swimming pool, your skin wrinkles. That's because the blood isn't circulating through there. It's kind of a defense mechanism. Your blood, the capillaries don't do that while you're in water. The problem is if you're in all the time, the blood won't circulate to the edges, and therefore your body can't fight a fungus that's in everything. And that's a fungus that will get in and begin to eat away at your skin, eat away at the blood vessels. And it literally as it eats away, there's stories that will literally take your toes off. There's stories about men would pull their socks and shoes off and their toes come with it. Huh? Hurts really, really bad. Really, really, really bad. And, but what are you going to do? You know, if you're like in that. Oh, wherever you go. In fact, anybody who's in the military, like if you're on the ground, so you're in the Army or the Marines, something like that, the number one thing, keep your feet dry. For obvious reasons. You can't fight like that. It's just misery in these trenches. And what these are French soldiers, and what is that? They've been doing a little rat hunting. Look at that thing. I mean, the rats would be everywhere. Yeah, that's an old, and the leather is so old it's hard as a rock. Yeah, that's, I mean, it's over 100 years old, that helmet. That's a trench in Belgium. That's a picture I took, and right here is into a tunnel. And there were tunnel wars between British and German soldiers. There, but it happened all over the line. They both try to tunnel through. Yes, you can go through if you like bats. I couldn't get that close because when I was there in Belgium, there was hoof and mouth. That's still used as a pasture land. And hoof and mouth is a disease that spreads through cows very quickly and go to humans. And so they wouldn't let us go into this area.
Just kidding.
No, it's not. Someone just gave it. Yeah. I know, I wondered the same thing. Both were given to me and by different people. And I guess in a few years down the road when I retire, I'll give them to somebody here. All right. But yeah, that was a fun year. And then hoof and mouth ravaging Europe and mad cow disease. Good times. Needless to say, you shouldn't have eaten beef when I was there. I didn't. So here are a few British soldiers. No, these are American soldiers about ready to go over the top. Notice them fixing the bayonet right there. Look how long the bayonet is. They rarely ever got that close. It was more just for show. But when you leave the trenches, you can imagine what's going to happen. Here's a British soldier at the saw. And you see what he's doing there? He's like, yeah, to the Germans, which makes me laugh, but he's like, I'm going to do something. It's not quite giving the finger, but close. So, both sides, a couple of the weapons really fast. These weapons had been invented before or something like them. Everyone talks about the machine gun. You can imagine 400 to 500 rounds a minute. And when there was an enemy attack, they wouldn't aim. They just spray bullets out in a little arc. And have a machine gun nest, machine gun nest, machine gun nest. So here are German machine gunners with the gas mask posing for the camera. Here's an American, 1918. These are Austrians. Why not? And the machine guns not only would make a charge across no man's land even more deadly, it was just the idea of it. Okay, shells exploding. That's even abstract. You can see these men, they're not aiming, they're just spraying bullets out to make it seem so dehumanizing. Machine gunners were rarely taken prisoner. Snipers were never taken prisoner. You know what I mean by that? Boy, do they hate machine gunners. And it's weird, they didn't have the same anger towards artillery men. You would think they would because it's even killing more, but it was just, you could see the machine gun. They could see who they're shooting at. Artillery is 15 miles behind the line. Even though both Ukraine and Russia are now saying they're not going to take artillerymen prisoner or they're going to charge them as war criminals. Because of their targeting civilians, and the Russians are just, they're Russians. Not all Russians, just the Russians who they are. And here's a few other examples of, here's a machine gun on a bike. Yeah, really? I mean, they tried everything, but I love the guy's hat. Here's a German example of that, where they would try to push behind, put a machine gun and rifles. Of course they didn't work. And then I had to give you the picture of the rat with a mine in it. But then, of course, what's this? Plans for a dog in a bomb. Have a dog run into a trench. As far as I know, they didn't really do this. I know the Russians, the Soviets used dogs to try to get German tanks in 42. It didn't work at all. Did not work. Desperation, yes, I agree, poor dogs. The humans don't have much of a choice, but dogs have even less of a choice. So with that, and then of course, this one is just surreal, so I had to show you this picture. A German cavalryman with a gas mask and a lance. That's 1918. It's kind of surreal. They still thought they might have cavalry charges. And this is obviously with the camera, there would be a gas mask for the horse. Oh. It didn't break. Yeah. Artillery, though, is the big killer. And as the war went on, the artillery got heavier and heavier and longer range. And more accurate. And in World War II, it got more and more accurate. And in this current war, in fact, artillery also includes artillery rockets. They would kind of use them in this war, but they just didn't work in World War II. But today, now, artillery rockets are one of the key weapons. And high explosives, they had a little recoil so they could be very accurate. This is called a trench mortar. They mentioned that in the video, but they would lob shells really high and come down like this. Big, heavy, high explosives. And that'd be the shockwave, which just rip bodies apart, along with the shrapnel. Here are American soldiers riding shells to the front. I just thought that was a really interesting picture. And here's a German. This makes me laugh. Like, really? Okay, so. Flamethrowers are also new weapons invented. They've been used before. Heck, if you know anything about the Byzantine Empire, they used something called Greek fire, even though we didn't even know what it was, but it would shoot kind of a jellied liquid gasoline. And it ranged about maybe 50 yards, eventually 100 yards. And the big thing about the jellied gasoline, when they would ignite it just as it left, it would shoot a jet of flame. It wasn't that accurate. But if you're shooting through a little cupola, like a sniper or a machine gunner, through a little cupola, and also there's jellied gasoline, are you going to sit there looking out your hole? No, you're going to duck. It's really good for hitting small targets they couldn't hit any other way. Just get jelly gas out of there. And when they first introduced it, the Germans were the first. Here's German flamethrowers. It kind of worked. But I think you can see the problem, why it would become less effective. These are highly trained crews carrying a tank of gasoline on their back. Here are French ones doing it. Can you imagine the casualty rate amongst them? Those trained crews would die very quickly. Yes, they still use flamethrowers. Most of them use flamethrower vehicles, but yeah, did not break the stalemate. Tanks was another effort invented by the British, and the idea was like a battleship that could go between the trenches and open the trench lines. And that's why you get this weird shape of the first mass-produced British tank. This is a Mark V. Kind of looks like a cough drop almost, but that's how I always think. I can't help it. And that wheel here to try to catch the back of a trench and keep going. They called it a tank because they try to hide the actual purpose of it. They said it's a water tank to bring supplies up to the front. And the name just stuck. So tank. They weren't effective in the war to break the stalemate, even though by 1918 they most certainly helped. But I think you see the problem with a tank like this. The engines were still so weak, it could go maybe 2 or 3 miles an hour on rough ground. There were such weak engines. Each of those had 2 engines. And I think I said the wrong number, but an 11-man crew. They have 2 engines, an engine for each tread. And just to turn it, you have to have 2 men kind of riding this thing inside the tank, which, by the way, there's carbon monoxide. They would get seasick inside these tanks, even if it just moved at 2 miles an hour. They'd be throwing up. It was just awful. It was hell in these little things. To turn one of these tanks, you had a man like this, like bracing himself, holding this lever, and forward, both would go forward. Brake, they both pull back. If they wanted to turn right, the guy on the right tread would have to brake. And the guy on the left would go full forward, like that, like that. I mean, it was just awful. And with thin armor, once the Germans got over the initial shock, they just pointed their guns down and yeah. But in mass numbers, they might have made the difference. The Germans never invested much. They made about a dozen of these monstrosities, and they just broke down, basically. The French started making it more like a modern tank, really thinly armored, still slow, but had a turret, either a small cannon or a machine gun. These Renaults. Those are French tanks in American service right there. Those are used by the Americans. And the more and more of like a modern tank. So the big thing was they saw potential of it, but it did not break the stalemate. But in the Treaty of Versailles, it says in the treaty that they forced Germany to sign, no tanks. So you can imagine what people are thinking after the war. If they're not going to allow Germany to have tanks, what does that mean about tanks? They must be really good and we want them. And so that would help create this kind of fervor to get more tanks, but it did not break the stalemate. Those are American. But you don't have to write this down. I just want to show you, this was the Russian example of a tank, and it's called the Tsar tank. And this gives you an idea of the size of this monstrosity. The thought was it would go roll right over the trenches. Did it work? Of course not. But it's just absolutely incredible. So here's a mock-up of one that's in a museum in Russia today. And look how massive this thing is. Look at the armored car next to it. It's not none of them survived, but they made about a half dozen of these things with a big turret on top. So all there is that I'm showing you this is how desperate they were to try to break the stalemate. It's pretty funny looking. But if you go through that valley, also a couple more things. Planes came into their own. And at first the planes were pretty primitive. France was the leader in plane technology. Even though the plane was invented in the United States, the Wright brothers wouldn't allow anybody to get even close to their patent. So there's almost no growth of planes in the US, but France was a leader. Germany wasn't far behind. But the first use of planes was reconnaissance. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen. All of a sudden you look up and say, oh, there's an enemy plane up there. And it sees everything we do. By the way, that's the first time we really started caring about camouflage. Be the planes. But then the next step, well, we got to shoot that plane down. Even though they talked about it before the war, it would not be before reconnaissance where you start getting planes like this, fighter planes, to shoot down reconnaissance. I also think you could guess the next step. They talked about bombing things from the air, but when they're flying over and saying, oh, there's a bunch of troops. If I only had a grenade, turn into bombing from the air. And so the thing about these planes, these are by 1917, and they were really romanticized during the war because the actual trench fighting was just slaughter. And so they made these almost like knights of the air fighting. They called them dogfights. The British started calling them that in 1916, where fighter planes would begin to fight each other. And this was a plane, this kind of plane used by the most famous of these dogfighters. In fact, if you shoot down 5 planes, they gave a name for it. Yeah, an ace. Anybody know what that plane was? Yeah. Baron von?
Yeah. Wasn't it by color?
Huh?
Wasn't it by color, like a color regiment?
No, that's German. Yeah. Baron von Richthofen. Yeah. There were, and they still called the segregated units colored regiments, but there was one pilot shot over 20. The leading American ace was a pilot by the name of Eddie Rickenbacker, which I just love the name Rickenbacker, but he shot down 26. Red Baron shot down 80. There were German aces in World War II that shot down almost 300. But over 5. It's a tri-wing. They had really light engines, so you had a bi or tri-wing to give them more lift, but they just can't move very fast. And the engines are so light that they might be a little metal and aluminum around the engine and the cockpit, but everything else is balsa wood and fabric. So these planes are actually, they've got sew patches on the side. They're all mostly fabric. There's still some fabric planes in World War II also, but the engines got better. And so you can imagine the problem with this. If you have balsa wood, where do you put a machine gun? The only place would be over the engine. You see a problem with being over the engine. This is a French. This is a French SPAD 13, a Sopwith Camel, a British plane. This is the kind of plane Snoopy flew. This is a Fokker DR-1, which is a German plane, and a Fokker D-7, which is probably the best plane in the world. The company's name was Fokker, moved to the Netherlands, still there. They put the machine guns over the engine. You see a problem? Every time the propeller goes up, yeah, so then you have to land very quickly. So you can only shoot for a while, then you start shooting your propeller off. The French started putting steel plates on the inside of the propeller so the propeller would survive, but occasionally the bullets would fly back in their face. The Germans tied the engine to the propeller, so when the propeller would come up, it wouldn't shoot for that instant. And once they figured that out, and the Allies copied it, all of a sudden fighter planes, they could survive. And so you went from just a few planes in combat to by 1918, there might be 1,000 planes in the air fighting each other, which must have just been unreal. By the way, what happens if you're shot down? You might rig up a parachute, like get a blanket and jump, but there were no parachutes yet. They talked about it, but you just had to land very quickly. This was a deadly business. We'll come back to planes. It's kind of funny, but also an interesting story. But here's the thing. They couldn't break the stalemate. None of them broke the stalemate. So they needed a long-term plan, AKA strategic. There's no tactical victory. They couldn't win on the battlefield. Attrition will take forever. And I just found this map, and I thought it was so wonderful. Not even thinking about, this was a few years ago when I found that the Russian map. And so, how do you break it? They needed long-term goals, and we're coming to, what did Sherman do? What do we call that? Total War, yeah. Now, this is where it got the name, Total War. And Total War was actually, the term was by this man here, Erich Ludendorff, the chief of the great German general staff in the last 2 years of the war. Probably the most important strategic planner of the war for Germany. No, he was not great for Germany. But his thought was break the will of the enemy to fight. Leave destruction. Here are Germans retreating from a town they destroyed. That's the overall German commander, Paul Hindenburg, and we'll get to him, Paul von Hindenburg. Yes, there'll be a Zeppelin named after him, but break their will to fight. If we can't beat them on the battlefield, beat them at home. And so, what did that mean? Yes, I'll explain that picture in just a second. War is a matter of political will. He understood that. Will countries stay in the war, especially when it becomes so horrible and the casualties become so high? Oh, sure. Every government will try to keep that away from their people, including the U.S. government. Like we saw in the video, the killing fields, how they censored the letters back home. They didn't want people to know how horrific it was. It's a matter of political will. Will a country stay in the fight? War is politics. So it's a matter of political will. By the way, what do Russian civilians know about their invasion of Ukraine? Nothing. They know nothing. They know some Russians have died. They have no idea how many. It's thousands of soldiers have died. The U.S. Defense Department thinks it's close to 50,000 casualties. Russian. It's bloody. I know it'd be awful, and it is. But they keep it secret because of political will. So obviously you want to bash that. And then there's something else. Remember talking about mobilizing? A country mobilizes their entire economy for war. Companies can't be producing cars for passengers or clothing for people because they need everything for war. And so if you mobilize the entire economy, doesn't the economy become a target? And that's where we get a new term then. Please be the right thing. The home front. We have the Western Front, the Russian Front, the Balkan Front, the Italian Front, and so on and so on. And now the home front. So I'm going into detail here. But every country adopts this in war. So in World War II, this is boom, it happens. Every country will adopt this in some way. And so, in 1919, the Allied plan was, they thought the war would still be going on, to use brand new heavy bombers that could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs. These big, massive biplanes, just weird, just almost like a monstrous looking planes. They were going to lay a carpet of chemical bombs, gas bombs, on German civilians. That was a plan by the US, the British, the French. Fortunately, the war ended before that happened. So when World War II began, what did everyone assume was going to happen to civilians? Those are British kids waiting for the inevitable German gas attack in 1940. Now, fortunately, gas was such an ineffective weapon that nobody used it. Oh, they used other horrific weapons, but they didn't use gas. Well, not that much. We're pretty sure there was some gas used on the Eastern Front in World War II, by both sides, but not on the Western Front. And without a doubt, Japan used it on China, without a doubt. But the home front. And so that gets to this basic idea. You have three strategic goals then in mind. Why you do this. First one, knock out their industry. The factories. And that's a shell factory in Britain. Those are heavy shells. Those 100, heck, these are 8-inch shells. By the way, they'll have a little hook on the edge of it so it can carry them. Destroy industry, or at least the transportation or the fuel. And more, the most important fuel, oil. World War II, it's all about oil. Gee, I wonder if there's going to be wars today about oil. It's all about oil. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because of oil. They're hoping the United States would be knocked out so they could take the Dutch East Indies, where there's a lot of oil. That's a place called Indonesia today. It's all about oil. To this day, fuel and resources, and it's only going to get more. Part of the reason Russia thought they could win is because the West, Europe would be so in need, so dependent upon Russian oil that they wouldn't do anything. By the way, it has affected things. Oil is now, it's getting close to $150 a barrel. And so don't be surprised if we see $5 a gallon gas in about 2 weeks. Because of the war. I mean, it's just. So, next. Oh, but it's really hard to hit a factory, isn't it? What else can you do? If you can't knock the factory out, what do you knock out instead? You kill others. Does that make sense? In a horrible, awful logic, if you make the workers suffer, the factory goes under. If you knock out their fresh water, they can't work. If you knock out their electricity, they can't function. If you knock out their heat, they can't work. 2, knock out their morale. Make war horrible. Make war suffering. It not only affects at home, but at the front. So because of the German submarine blockade, here we have rationing in Britain. Rationing of food. Corned meat is just really heavily salted, vague meat. And here, showing her looking at the prices and how difficult it was to get food. And the point is, here's British soldiers at the front. If your family's suffering, might that affect your morale at the front? I want this thing to end. That's why they kind of keep it secret on both ways how bad it is. But here's the biggie. Total war brings terror to the population. And as the bell rang, You can leave. All right. So tomorrow I'll have that. Oh, shoot, no, I won't have. I can give you one. I'll post up the bookmark. I'll get it one. I just don't have a copy. I'll give that on Friday. Sound good? I'll give it on Friday, and if you don't make it on Friday, I'll still be posting.
When is that getting to?
Tuesday.
Like, I would like certified, and then it's like, we'll take a huge.
And then.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what I'm
The wheel would like collapse when it hit one of those trenches.
Thank you for reminding me to turn the camera on.